My mom said I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving BC. My stepdad's parents, who hate me, would be there, so I. Emily's father passed away when she was 7 years old, leaving a void in her life that could never truly be filled. His absence cast a long shadow over her childhood, one that would shape her in ways she could not yet understand. The pain of his loss was something that never quite faded, only dulled over time. Her mother, suddenly a widow, was thrust into a relentless struggle to keep them afloat. 4 years, it was just the two of them, navigating a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Money was tight, painfully so. Emily's mother took on multiple jobs, working long hours that left her exhausted. She would come home late, too tired to do much more than collapse onto the couch. Emily learned early on to fend for herself, heating up whatever leftovers they had or going to bed with an empty stomach on the nights when there was nothing left. Their small apartment was cramped and constantly. Emily had been hopeful at first. When her mother married Mark, their lives changed overnight. Gone were the days of struggling to make rent, of going without new clothes for school, of watching her mother work herself into exhaustion just to keep food on the table. Mark's family had money. A big house, nice cars, and enough financial security to make Emily believe, for the first time in years, that maybe things would be okay. At first, Mark's parents, Richard and Susan, seemed warm and welcoming. They spoke kindly to Emily, bought her gifts, and assured her that she was now part of the family. Her mother, too, seemed relieved to finally have stability. Emily wanted to believe it was real. She wanted to trust them. But it didn't take long before things started feeling off. It was the basement that made Emily uneasy first. It was always locked, and whenever someone disappeared behind that door, they would stay down there for hours. The few times she saw people come back up, their eyes looked different, red-rimmed, distant, like they weren't entirely present. Conversations in hushed voices would stop the second she entered the room, and she started noticing strange exchanges. Small plastic baggies passing from hand to hand, folded-up bills slipping into pockets, whispered words that felt too urgent, too secret. And then there was Mark's father, her new step-grandfather, a wiry old man named Harold who spent most of his time in the garage. From the moment Emily met him, he had unsettled her. His eyes were sharp, constantly flicking over people like he was assessing them. He smelled of chemicals and something stale, something rotten. One afternoon, curiosity got the best of her. The door to the garage had been left slightly open, and she peeked inside. Harold was at his workbench, a small digital scale in front of him, carefully measuring a white powdery substance into tiny plastic bags. Next to him was a stack of cash, more than Emily had ever seen in her life. Her stomach twisted, and she stepped back quickly before he could notice her. She wanted to tell her mother, to ask if she had noticed anything strange. But every time she tried, something stopped her. Her mother was happy for the first time in years. She wasn't working herself to death anymore, and she had that light in her eyes again, the one that had disappeared after Emily's father died. Could she really ruin that for her? So, Emily stayed silent. But things only got worse. Mark's younger brother, Chase, was another problem. He was in his early 20s, still living at home, and had an air of untouchability about him. He would come and go at odd hours, usually reeking of alcohol or something harsher. The first time he spoke to Emily, it wasn't with the warmness of an older brother, it was with a lazy smirk and a slow, deliberate look that made her skin crawl. "You're not bad looking for a kid," he had muttered, ruffling her hair like she was some pet. Emily had laughed nervously, unsure how to react. Her mother had been right there, smiling at how well everyone was getting along, completely oblivious to the way Chase's eyes lingered on Emily just a second too long. The more time passed, the more she realized she was trapped. This wasn't just a wealthy family with a few eccentric habits. There was something dark running beneath the surface, something dangerous. But there was nowhere for her to go, no one to turn to. If she spoke up, what would happen? Would Mark get angry? Would her mother believe her? One night, she overheard a conversation between Mark and Chase. She had been heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard voices from the living room. "You need to be careful," Mark was saying in a low voice. "She's not stupid. I've seen the way she watches." Chase scoffed. "She's just a kid." "She's a kid who notices things," Mark shot back. "And if she says anything, you know what'll happen." There was a pause, then the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "She won't," Chase said finally, his voice lazy and assured. "Because where would she go?" Emily pressed her hand over her mouth, her heart pounding. She turned and hurried back to her room, her throat tight with panic. She knew then that they were watching her, too. They knew she had seen something, that she was putting things together. And they weren't worried. Because, like Chase said, where would she go? Emily started avoiding everyone as much as she could. She stayed in her room, barely spoke at dinner, and tried to keep her head down. But that only made things worse. It made them notice her more. One evening, Richard, Mark's father, called her over while the adults were sitting on the back patio. The air smelled like cigars and whiskey, thick and heavy. She hesitated, but her mother was watching, smiling at her, so she had no choice but to go. "Sit down, sweetheart," Richard said, patting the chair next to him. His voice was kind, but there was something behind his eyes that made her stomach churn. She sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. "I hear you've been acting a little distant lately," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You wouldn't be worried about something, would you?" Emily forced a smile. "No." He nodded slowly, still watching her. "Good," he said after a long moment. "Because you don't have anything to be worried about. You're part of the family now, and family takes care of each other." There was a warning in his words, hidden beneath the warmth. Emily nodded and excused herself as soon as she could, feeling his eyes follow her as she left. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The walls felt like they were closing in, the house too big, too full of secrets she wasn't supposed to know. She understood now. She wasn't just living with them. She was trapped, and they knew it. Emily had never felt more alone in her life. She had spent weeks pretending everything was fine, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact with Mark, Chase, and Richard. She moved through the house like a ghost, afraid that any wrong move would make them turn on her completely. But the weight of it all, the secrets, the fear, the suffocating feeling of being watched, was too much. She couldn't take it anymore. One night, after dinner, when Mark was in the study and the others were outside, she finally gathered the courage to talk to her mother. She found her in the kitchen, rinsing dishes in the oversized sink, humming softly to herself. "Mom," Emily started, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother turned, smiling, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Emily. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about something serious. It's about Mark's family. About what's going on in the garage. In the basement." The smile faded from her mother's face. "Emily, what are you talking about?" "I've seen it," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I know what they're doing. The drugs, the money, Mark's father, Chase, they're dealing. I saw Richard weighing things. I saw—" "Stop." Her mother's voice was sharp, a tone Emily hadn't heard in a long time. Emily blinked, taken aback. "Mom, you have to believe me." Her mother turned off the faucet, drying her hands slowly. "Emily, I don't know what you've been thinking, but whatever you've imagined, you need to let it go. This family has done nothing but help us. Mark has given us a home, a future. And you're accusing them of criminal activity." Emily's stomach twisted. "It's not an accusation if it's the truth." Her mother's expression darkened. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? What this could do?" "It's already happening, Mom. And I know you've noticed it too. You're just pretending not to see it." Before she could say anything else, Mark walked in. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes flicking between them. "What's going on?" Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her mother turned to him, her face tight with tension. Emily thinks she's seen something. Mark's expression hardened. He took a step closer, his presence suddenly overwhelming. Seen what, exactly? Emily's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to stand her ground. I know about the drugs. I know what your family is doing. I saw Richard in the garage. I saw people going in and out of the basement. Mark exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then he laughed. A cold, humorless sound. Wow, he muttered. That's quite the story. Emily's hands clenched into fists. It's not a story. It's the truth. Mark's expression turned deadly serious. You're calling my father a drug dealer? Her mother stepped between them, her face pale. Emily, that's enough. Mom, please, Emily begged. You know I wouldn't make this up. But her mother didn't look at her. She looked at Mark. Emily felt something inside her break. You really think Mark and his family would do something like that? Her mother asked, her voice trembling, but not with fear. With anger. Do you hear yourself? You're trying to tear this family apart with your lies. Emily stared at her, unable to believe what she was hearing. Mom, I'm not lying. Mark sighed and rubbed his temples like he was dealing with a difficult child. This is insane. She's making this up. I'm not making it up. Emily snapped. But the damage was already done. Within the hour, the entire family had gathered. Richard sat in his chair, shaking his head in disappointment, while Susan hovered near him, whispering to Chase, who was smirking like this was all some kind of joke. Emily stood in the middle of the room, her mother beside her, but it didn't feel like she had an ally. It felt like she was already on trial. Do you know how serious an accusation like this is? Richard asked. His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it. You're accusing your own family of being criminals. You're not my family, Emily said through gritted teeth. Richard sighed dramatically. It's really a shame, Susan. We took her in, we gave her a home, and this is how she repays us. Her mother flinched. Emily, apologize. What? Apologize, her mother repeated, her voice sharp. For what you just said. Right now. Emily felt like she was going to be sick. You want me to apologize for telling the truth? Mark folded his arms. If you don't, there's going to be consequences. Like what? Emily snapped. Silence. Then Richard leaned forward, his eyes cold. Like the fact that you won't be staying here much longer. Emily turned to her mother, desperate now. Mom, you can't seriously be letting them do this. Her mother wouldn't look at her. You're going to stay with Aunt Linda, she said quietly. It's for the best. Emily's vision blurred. You're sending me away? Her mother finally met her eyes. There was something in them, guilt? Shame? Or worse, relief. It's already decided, Mark said. Emily shook her head. No. No, you don't get to do this. You brought this on yourself, Richard said, standing up. Accusing good people of something so disgusting? You should be ashamed. Emily was shaking. This isn't fair. Chase grinned at her from across the room. Sucks, doesn't it? She wanted to scream. Instead, she ran. She ran up the stairs, slammed her door shut, and locked it. Her heart was pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But it was. She could hear them downstairs, still talking, still deciding what to do with her like she was nothing. Like she didn't even matter. Her own mother had abandoned her. By the next morning, her bags were packed. A one-way ticket was bought. And Emily, against her will, was sent away. The last thing she saw before getting into the car was her mother standing in the doorway. But she didn't say goodbye. She just watched as Emily disappeared. Emily had sworn to herself that she would never need anyone again. After being sent away like a problem to be discarded, she had spent the first few months at Aunt Linda's house in complete shock. Her mother had abandoned her. Mark and his family had made sure she was cut off. They had won. And she? She had nothing. But Emily was done being powerless. She threw herself into school, into working, into surviving. She had no one to fall back on, no safety net if she failed. She took on scholarships, part-time jobs, anything that would keep her moving forward. She worked twice as hard as everyone else, refusing to let herself sink. She refused to be the girl Mark's family had sent away like she was nothing. By the time she graduated from college, she had something they never thought she would: power. A well-paying job. Financial stability. Her own apartment. Freedom. For years there was silence. She didn't hear from her mother, and she didn't reach out either. Even though it burned, even though there were nights she wanted nothing more than to call and ask why had she chosen them over her own daughter, she kept her pride. And then, out of nowhere, her mother called. Emily saw the name on her screen and almost didn't pick up. But curiosity got the best of her. She answered. Her mother's voice was shaky, but painfully familiar. Emily. Sweetheart. How are you? Emily hesitated. I'm fine. Why are you calling? There was a pause. Then, in a voice laced with forced casualness, her mother said, I just wanted to check in. See how you've been. Emily almost laughed. After all these years? Now, she wanted to know? But then, her mother sighed, and Emily heard it, the real reason for the call. It's Mark, she said finally. He lost his job. Things have been really difficult. The mortgage payments, Emily closed her eyes. There it was. I wouldn't be asking if we weren't desperate, her mother continued. Emily, please. I need your help. Emily should have hung up. She should have told her mother that she owed her nothing and walked away. But she didn't. Because no matter how much she tried to harden herself, a part of her still wanted her mother's love. A part of her still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother had regretted what she had done. So she helped. At first, it was small amounts. A few $100s here and there, enough to help with groceries, utilities. But it quickly grew. The mortgage payments were behind, the debt was stacking up, and the house that Emily had been thrown out of, was on the verge of foreclosure. So she sent money. Every month, without fail. For over a year. She never spoke to Mark, to Richard, to Susan. It was always her mother. And as much as it pained her, Emily let herself believe, maybe this was the start of something new. Maybe, after all this time, her mother finally saw her as family again. Then Thanksgiving came. Her mother called one evening, her voice softer than usual. Emily, sweetheart. I wanted to talk to you about Thanksgiving dinner. Emily smiled a little. Yeah? What about it? Her mother hesitated. There's been a little issue, she said. Mark's parents, they don't feel comfortable with you coming. Emily's stomach twisted. What? Her mother rushed to explain. It's just, they feel like, after everything that happened, it would be difficult. You know how Richard and Susan are. They just think it would be best if we keep things peaceful this year. Peaceful. Emily gripped the phone tighter. You mean they don't want me there? Her mother let out a breath. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. Silence. Emily laughed bitterly. I've been paying for their house for over a year. And they can't even sit at the same table as me. Emily, please. No, Emily's voice was sharp now. Tell me the truth, Mom. Are you okay with this? There was no answer. And that was enough. Emily let out a slow breath. You know what? Fine. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. But don't call me again. Her mother gasped. Emily. She hung up. And for the first time in years, she felt free. Emily had spent years holding back, swallowing her anger, telling herself that she was better off without them. But this was too much. They had taken everything from her. They had sent her away, cut her off, let her struggle alone while they lived comfortably in a house she had been paying for. And now, after all her help, after over a year of sending them money without question, they had the audacity to tell her she wasn't welcome? That Richard and Susan didn't feel comfortable having her there? No. Emily wasn't going to let them push her aside this time. So on Thanksgiving night, she drove to the house. It was a house she had been helping to keep, one she had been stupid enough to think would finally make her feel like she belonged again. But standing outside, staring at the windows glowing warmly from inside, she felt nothing but rage. She stepped up to the door and knocked hard. She could hear the sound of laughter inside, the clinking of glasses, the warmth of a family dinner she had been excluded from. The door swung open, and her mother stood there, her face draining of color. Emily! Emily didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside. The conversation at the dinner table stopped. Every face turned toward her. Mark, Richard, Susan, Chase, even some unfamiliar ones. All of them stared like she was a ghost. "Well," Emily said, her voice dripping with venom. "Happy Thanksgiving." Richard was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Wasn't expecting you." "Yeah, I figured," Emily snapped. "Since I was uninvited." Her mother stepped in front of her, her voice panicked. "Emily, sweetheart, maybe we can talk outside." "No, we're talking here," Emily said, her voice like steel. "In the house I've been paying for." Mark put his fork down slowly, his eyes cold. "That's enough." "Is it?" Emily shot back. "Because I don't think it is." The tension in the room was thick. Her mother looked like she wanted to disappear, while Chase was smirking in the corner like this was the best entertainment he'd had all night. Emily's heart was pounding, but she wasn't backing down. "Let me get this straight, I've been sending you money for over a year. And you couldn't even give me a seat at the table?" Her mother wrung her hands. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple," Emily snapped. "But you know what? It's fine. Because I'm here now." She pulled out a chair and sat down. No one spoke. Mark's jaw was tight, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't like losing control, and Emily knew it. But he also wasn't going to cause a scene in front of company. Emily picked up a glass of wine from the table and took a slow sip, staring directly at him. "So," she said, smiling, "what are we all thankful for this year?" Silence. Then Susan sighed dramatically. "You've made your point, Emily. Maybe it's best if you leave." Emily set the glass down. "Maybe it's best if you shut up." Richard let out a low chuckle. "Feisty, isn't she?" Emily ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Mark. I was going to leave it at this. Walk in, make my statement, leave you all to choke on your turkey. But then, as I was walking in, I noticed something interesting." Mark's fingers twitched slightly. Emily tilted her head. "It's funny, I always wondered why the basement door was always locked when I lived here. Why people kept disappearing downstairs, why there were so many visitors." Her mother stiffened. "Emily." "But now it all makes sense," Emily continued, smiling coldly. "Because you weren't just ignoring what was happening here, were you, Mark? You weren't just complicit." Mark's eyes darkened. "Careful, Emily." Emily leaned forward. "You were running it." The air in the room changed instantly. Her mother looked horrified. Richard's smirk slipped. Chase's amusement vanished. Mark's expression was unreadable. But Emily saw the muscle in his jaw clench. "You don't know what you're talking about," Mark said evenly. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen, then turned it to face him. Photos. Mark's face. Richard's. Chase's. Stacks of money. Baggies of substances. Weighing scales. Meetings in the garage. She had spent the past month gathering proof, coming back to the house under the guise of dropping off checks, parking down the street to take pictures, pretending to be too stupid to notice the truth. And now, she had everything. Mark's face went blank. "Where did you get that?" Emily smiled. "You're not as careful as you think you are." Chase swore under his breath. Susan looked at Richard, who had gone deathly still. Her mother was shaking her head. "Emily, please tell me you didn't." "Oh, I did," Emily said. "I sent everything to the police 10 minutes ago." Panic. Mark shot up from his chair. "You stupid little—" Emily was already stepping back, already reaching for the door. "I'd love to stay for dessert, but I think I'll pass." Behind her, she heard the distant sound of sirens. Thanksgiving was about to get interesting. The flashing red and blue lights cast an eerie glow over the house. Emily stood on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold night air, as uniformed officers poured through the front door. The sound of shouts, orders being barked, and the scuffle of feet echoed through the night. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching the downfall of the family that had once looked so pristine from the outside. She didn't flinch when they dragged Mark out first. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his expression caught somewhere between rage and disbelief. His eyes locked onto Emily, dark and full of venom. "You did this," he spat as an officer tightened the grip on his arm. Emily didn't look away. "Yeah, I did." Richard was next. The once composed, self-assured man was now shouting at the officers, calling them corrupt, screaming about how this was all some mistake. He turned his furious gaze to Emily. "You think you're so righteous?" he bellowed. "You just destroyed your own family." "You weren't my family," Emily said coldly. Chase came out last. Unlike Mark and Richard, he wasn't shouting. He was smirking. He turned his head toward Emily as they shoved him into the back of a squad car. "Bet that felt good, huh?" he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Being the one in control for once. Emily felt her hands clench into fists, but she refused to give him a reaction. She just watched as the doors slammed shut, locking them all away. And then, the moment she had been dreading. Her mother. She came stumbling out of the house, not in cuffs, but looking just as broken as if she were. Her face was red with anger, her eyes brimming with fury and betrayal. She didn't run to Emily. She didn't even look at Mark as he was driven away. She came straight for her daughter. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to stay firm. "I stopped letting them get away with it." Her mother let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think you're some kind of hero? I think I did the right thing. You destroyed this family." Emily's jaw clenched. "They were criminals, Mom." Her mother shook her head violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to sit there, all high and mighty, after everything Mark has done for us. After everything Richard has given me. Given you." Emily snapped. "He didn't give you anything. He used you. He let you believe you were safe while he was running a drug operation out of your own home." Her mother's lip trembled, but she didn't back down. "We had a life, Emily. A real life. You took that away from me." Emily stared at her, the weight of her mother's words hitting her harder than she had expected. Her mother didn't care about the truth. She only cared about what she had lost. "I took away a lie," Emily said finally. "And you're mad that you don't get to keep living in it." Her mother's expression twisted into something ugly. "I should have never called you." Emily felt something inside her go cold. She nodded once. "Yeah. I think we can both agree on that." And then she turned and walked away. She didn't look back when her mother called her name, didn't stop when the sobs turned to curses. She kept walking, each step pushing her further away from the life she had once tried so hard to belong to. The trial came months later. Mark took a plea deal. 15 years. No chance of parole for 10. Richard and Chase weren't so lucky. Both of them were looking at 2 decades behind bars, minimum. Susan avoided prison but lost everything. The house, the money, the respectability she had clung to so desperately. Emily didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. She had done her part. And yet, late at night, she still found herself wondering. Not if she had made the right choice, she knew she had. But if her mother ever regretted hers. If she ever sat alone in whatever place she had ended up and thought about the daughter she had thrown away. But Emily would never know. Because she never called again.